Good morning. I guess this is working. My name is Nancy Buffum. I am this morning's worship associate. I use she, he, or they pronouns. Today, I am wearing orange print overalls and an orange t-shirt. The UU Indigenous Connection Circle has reminded us and invited us as allies to join Indigenous people to wear orange this Sunday to symbolize solidarity, mourning, and reconciliation with Native families who were hurt by the kidnappings of their children during the boarding school era. The orange shirt reminds us to remember them. Welcome to all of you here in the sanctuary and on Zoom. Our ministerial intern, Ember, is the Zoom chaplain today. They are following the Zoom chat and will be reading the joys and sorrows from our Zoom congregation at that portion of the service. Welcome old friends and new, every age, each of you who comes here from your unique origin and brings your beliefs, questions, sexualities, genders, unique gifts and needs. Just as you are welcome here. I would like to invite Silas to please come forward to light the chalice. As Unitarian Universalists, we belong to a faith tradition that helps ground us in unsure times. The reading that Reverend Dennis and I will do together is by Deborah Falk.
A chalice lit in our midst is a symbol of our liberal faith.
A faith built on the foundations of freedom, reason, and welcome.
A faith sustained by acts of kindness and justice.
A faith that envisions a world flourishing with equity for all people.
A faith that demands the living out of goodness.
A faith that requires thoughtfulness.
A faith of wholeness.
Remembrance.
As they go their way in peace. In these challenging times, it's sometimes difficult for all of us to feel that we truly can go our way in peace. My morning, like many of yours, are filled with the news postings that have appeared in my inbox through the night. Heather Cox Richardson's, how many people read Heather? I knew it's a UU kind of thing, right? Her telling critiques of the latest iterations of evil coming out of Washington, D.C., and the New York Times reports of the unhappy and challenging news are there for me every single morning, morning after morning after morning. I read them. I cannot turn aside. And yet I do, most mornings, manage to postpone them. I try to begin my day by going outside. I go outside because I have to in the summer because I don't have an irrigation system and I have a yard and garden that requires my attention. So I go out and I water the veggies and the flowers and I take time to pay attention to what is blooming that morning or what is just in bud ready to watch emerge the very next day or perhaps the day after. And I go out into the veggie garden each day to see what's ripening. And maybe I'll get to pluck a tomato or two, or maybe I'll look at that zucchini that it's like I'm trying to figure out what to do with yet another one. You know, and it's an important beginning to my day. And then I go and address the realities that are emerging in the news. These past few months, my outside time has been moving closer to sunrise. As the time I get up, which is later it used to be when I had to be at work at 8 a.m. every morning, is about the same time as sunrise. And so my morning time outside is bathed in a soft, tangerine-hued light of sunrise. This morning when I drove to church a couple hours after sunrise, because of the way the sun was filtering through the clouds, that same tint of light, a color I call Monet light, was there for a longer period of time. When I'm outside in the morning, I try to take a moment to look at the birds around me, and because we feed them much of the year, they come to my yard. And I live in a little valley where on the ridge line there's a nesting area for vultures. And so they circle high above. And I pay attention to those birds that I know are looking down and observing what those of us humans might be up to. Praise for such mornings. We belong in a world that is filled with the light and the life of nature. We are part of an interwoven web of all of that and all this. We are a part of that, not a part, not separate, but deeply connected. And you and I belong to a liberal religious tradition that has often affirmed the reality of that connection and the deep inspiration that can come to us from the natural world. It's embedded in our principles and our value statements. And we have voices in our history that affirm such reality. There's Henry David Thoreau, who I shared a little bit about with this morning, and his buddy, Ralph Waldo Emerson, who, as I said, every Thursday night, Thoreau would go into town when he lived at Walden to be in community with his friend Ralph Waldo and the others who would gather there. It's said that in his simple shack in Walden, Thoreau had 3 chairs. He said one was for sitting while dining or reading. The second one was for conversation, and a third so he could have community. Community. They would gather there at Emerson's, along with the noted Unitarian minister William Ellery Channing, the writers Nathaniel Hawthorne and Louisa May Alcott, and Louisa's father, the educator and philosopher Bronson Alcott, and the editor and writer Margaret Fuller, a group of folks that came to be known as the Transcendentalists. And we folks are those folks, philosophical and theological descendants. We are the iteration of their thoughts in this times. We are part of a living tradition, a tradition that honors its past and looks ahead, dreaming of a better future and working in the here and now to make such a future a reality. And we do that together as community. So let's take a moment to simply be together this morning, to breathe together in a very short meditation. So I invite you as we enter into deeper worship this morning to join me first in silence, which then will be followed by music, and then some words as we worship together. I invite you to take one deep, full breath in and let it out slowly as we breathe together. Echoing, okay. Now, as I shared, our reading are words from Ralph Waldo Emerson. And as I shared, Henry David and Ralph Waldo shared a tendency to use more than one first name and a deep friendship. They would get together to think deeply, and they would write. And people wanted to hear what they had to say. Emerson in particular went on a lecture circuit. And in 1838, I have to get that right, 1838, the graduating class of Harvard Divinity School invited Emerson to come deliver the address on their graduation that summer. It's gone down in UU history as the Divinity School address, because therein he critiqued some of the traditions of our previously more staid and traditional church. He also lifted up the beauty-filled inspiration that the natural world provides. Thus, he began. In this refulgent summer, it has been a luxury to draw the breath of life. The grass grows, the buds burst, the meadow is spotted with fire and gold in the glint of flowers. The air is full of birds, and the sweet with the breath of pine, and the balm of Gilead and the new hay. Night brings no gloom to the heart with its welcome shade.
Through the transparent darkness, the stars pour their almost spiritual rays. Humanity under them seems a young child, their huge globe a toy. The cool night bathes the world as with a river and prepares their eyes again for crimson dawn. The mystery of nature was never displayed more happily. The never broken silence with which the old bounty goes forward has not yielded yet one word of explanation.
One is constrained to respect the perfection of this world in which our senses converse. How wide, how rich, what invitation from every property it gives to every faculty of humanity.
But when the mind opens and reveals the laws which traverse the universe and makes things what they are, then shrinks the great world at once to a mere illustration and a fable of this mind. What am I? And what is? Asks the human spirit, with a curiosity newly kindled, but never to be quenched. I would study, I would know, I would admire forever. These works of thought have been the entertainments of the human spirit in all ages.
What am I? What is? Emerson asked himself those fundamental, deeply spiritual questions. He asked them of those gathered at the Divinity School graduation, and down through time, we're asked those same deeply spiritual questions. What am I? What is? To explore such questions, I would like to suggest that one of the places we might look is into the words of wisdom that have been handed down to us from the past, particularly today from those within our own Unitarian Universalist tradition. So I invite you to go back in time with me for a moment, back in time to April 19th, 1775. On that famous day, a group of colonists
Dennis, you bumped your mute button on.
Oh, I bumped the button. I've done that before. It's on the bottom, Kat. Are we good now? Okay. I'll get this extra book out of the way, so I'm less likely to do that. April 19, 1775. On that famous day, a group of colonists summoned by Paul Revere and his often forgotten co-writers, William Dawes and Samuel Prescott, had gathered at Northridge at Concord, determined to halt the advance of British soldiers who were marching that day. Someone fired a shot. Nobody knows for sure whom, but it was called "The Shot Heard Round the World," and thus began the American Revolution. Across the green, a young minister and his family gathered to watch the encounter. The minister's wife, Phoebe, held in her arms her young daughter, Mary. Years later, Mary Moody Emerson, a true daughter of the American Revolution, had an opportunity to meet General Lafayette. And when she met him, she said, "You know, General, I was at arms at Concord." Mary Moody Emerson, a true daughter of the American Revolution, would her own way abet a revolution in ideas that helped change American culture, attitudes, and religious life. The war that started that day would alter history, and it would change the life of Mary Moody Emerson. Her father enlisted to serve the cause and served as a chaplain. In 1776, he died from what was called Army fever. Mary Moody said later, "He loved his family well and was to it as good as an angel. He loved our beloved revolution better, and he would minister to it," he said, though it would cost his life. His widow, unable to support the family, went to live with other members of the family. And Mary was sent to live with and to be raised by a maternal grandmother and an aunt. This was not an unusual kind of circumstance in those times. Mary's separation from her siblings and the isolation that accompanied it shaped her. She lived as an only child. Her tendency to be a loner became a necessity of survival. In time, she found comfort and community in books. She read and thought with a depth not common for young women of her time, because in a woman's headed household, she had the opportunity to do so. She was not subject to the cultural limitations on behavior than many of her fellow female peers. Let's not forget the reality of those times. It very clearly and intentionally stated in the Declaration that all men are created equal. And let's remember, it meant white landed men in those times. Women were given no such equality or inalienable rights to life, pursuit, and happiness. Mary Moody Emerson, though, was through her scholarship and deep thought able to speak and write in a manner that helped shape the thoughts of feminists in the generations that followed her and the views of her famous nephew, Ralph Waldo Emerson. As part of my seminary studies, I encountered a pretty amazing book. It was titled Mary Moody Emerson and the Origins of Transcendentalism, A Family History by our author, Phyllis Cole. It was a fascinating account of the family and the times and of a theology that shapes our movement. Ralph Waldo Emerson, a significant shaper of our faith, came from a long line of ministers. It seems that grandfathers on both sides of the family had been ministers. Ralph Waldo was a minister for a little while, like 2.5 years, but he broke with his congregation over what kind of worship service they'd have. In particular, there was a dispute as to whether or not he should offer communion each Sunday morning. Ralph Waldo said he did not want to participate in such a practice because he felt it was outdated and rather irrelevant. So he left the ministry and started a far more rewarding career as a writer and lecturer. UU ministry even then didn't pay all that well. Now, a much more limited range of possibilities existed for a woman. A woman could best secure a stable home through marriage. Marriage journals indicate that she declined at least 2 proposals of marriage. She wrote in her journal, "I never expected connection and matrimony. My taste was formed about matrimony, and I knew I was not destined to please. I love God and His creation as never else could." Now, Mary had the good fortune to inherit from her grandmother a small farm. She later sold it and bought a share in a home of what was then the wilderness of Maine. As she had no family of her own, Mary would often be called to provide assistance for a family in need. A new baby, an illness in the household. Call Aunt Mary, she'll come and help out in the kitchen. Well, what it meant for Mary, she was able to access many family libraries. In time, she secured a small library of her own. Now, Mary Moody Emerson was a bit eccentric, and some say she was difficult to live with. She had little patience for the niceties and restrictive manners that women of those times were expected to follow. She wore drab clothing, and late in her life, she wore a kind of little cap that was normally only worn at funerals. Go figure. Mary Moody Emerson definitely walked to a different drummer. Adjusting for the gendered language, her lifestyle was very much in line with what Ralph Waldo wrote of in his noted book, noted essay, Self-Reliance. Whosoever would be a man must be a nonconformist. One who would gather immortal palms must not be hindered by the name of goodness, but must explore if it be goodness. Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. Absolve yourself to yourself, and you shall have the suffrage of the world. In describing an interchange with his nonconformist Aunt Mary, Ralph Waldo also wrote, "I remember an answer which when quite young I was prompted to make to a valued advisor. On my saying, 'What have I have to do with the sacredness of tradition? I lived wholly from within,' my friend suggested. 'But those impulses may be from below, not from above.' I replied, 'They do not seem to me to be such, but if I am the devil's child, I will live from the devil.'" And he continued, "No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to this or that. The only right is to what's after my conscience. The only wrong, what is against it. To believe our own thought, to believe that what is true for you in your private heart is true for all, that is genius. One should learn to detect and watch that gleam of light which flashes across one's mind from within." A gleam of light that flashes across our minds. While Aunt Mary urged Ralph Waldo to continue to hold to the doctrines of the church, she also encouraged him to seek answers in his own mind, to look for those flashes, and to not merely follow convention and tradition. Early on, she herself developed her taste for books. She read extensively. She began with novels, and then the early readings included the Bible. She read the English poets Milton and Young. As a young woman, she would read Plato, Marcus Aurelius, Shakespeare, Coleridge, Wordsworth, Locke, Channing, Byron, Spinoza, Rousseau, Goethe, and numerous others. Her education through books, lectures, correspondence, sermons, and conversations was completely self-directed, as she describes it. She was an insatiate. Let me find the quote again. Wait a minute. Oh, this one is seeking personal truth, acknowledge this general concern in her life. Ralph Waldo described her as being part of the sect of seekers. She described herself as an insatiate, roaming about metaphysics and Illuminati. An insatiate, a sect of seekers. Sounds to me like a sect of Unitarian Universalists, don't you think? She wrote in one of her earliest surviving entries in her journal, "But in the dead of night, near morning when the eastern stars glow, with a luster that penetrates the spirit with wonder and curiosity, how odd, how can one fear?" She was a deeply religious woman, but she wrote of Christian doctrine as feminine. She wrote, "Her majesty is full of mystery, strongly impressed with joy and hope. Her eyes raised to heaven with tears for Zion and rays of glory descending to earth at her entreaties. Mary's writings were only occasionally published, as was the reality for most women in those times. And her sources were often deep conversations, prayer, or her own reading. Yet this fearless, independent, thoughtful woman helped to shape the Emerson that we readers know. In a public address about her, Waldo, sometimes they called him just Waldo apparently, reported that it was the privilege of certain boys to have this immeasurable high standard indicated to their childhood, a blessing which nothing else in education could supply. Mary herself developed a great facility with language, and her descriptions of the natural world rivaled those of her acclaimed and often published nephew. In an 1822 entry in her personal journal, her almanac, she wrote of lamps held out in the firmament. These lamps were held to measure out some of the moments of eternity, to divide the history of God's operations in the birth and death of nations, of world. It is a goodly name for our notions of breathing, suffering, enjoying, acting. We personify it. What a great word. We call it by every name of fleeting, dreaming, vaporing, imagery. Yet it is nothing. We exist in eternity, dissolved, the body and the night is gone, the stars are extinguished, and we measure duration by the number of our thoughts, by the activity of reason, the discovery of truth. Now, such transcendent spirituality definitely seemed to foreshadow Ralph Waldo's writings. 20 years later, in 1842, he wrote, "The Transcendentalists adopts the whole connection of spiritual doctrine. They believe in miracle, in the perceptual openness of the human mind to new influx of light and power. He believes in inspiration and in ecstasy. They wish that the spiritual practice should be suffered to demonstrate itself to the end in all possible applications to the state of humanity without the admission of anything unspiritual, that is, anything positive, dogmatic, personal. Thus, the spiritual measure of inspiration is the depth of thought." Mary called it the discovery of truth. Ralph Waldo called it inspiration in the depths of thought. Mary inspired Waldo and gave to him and through him to us the gifts of her intellect, developed through deep thought and often difficult times of solitude and material poverty. It's important to note that he kept her almanac for a time and transcribed it. Now, I won't go as far as my history professor at seminary said, that he perhaps presented words that were actually hers as though they were her own. But most scholars agree, who have had an opportunity to look at her work, that he was at least deeply inspired by what she has written. He advised her to look deeply within, to the true self, to listen to another's deepest pondering, and to respond not with our answers to their questions, but rather with prompts and suggestions that help each individual to determine what they hold to be true. That, to me, is a pretty good description of what mentorship looks like. I remember in my own emerging adulthood, I was coming into adulthood with the wise counsel of the Unitarian Universalist minister Adolf Weidance, who would spend long hours with the youth group, the LRY group at that church, in deep conversation, listening deeply what we had to say, offering prompts and questions more than answers. You may have had the good fortune to have a family member, a teacher, or professor, or other important mentor with whom you could explore your deepest and most profound questions. It may, in fact, have been a band director long ago in Texas. You may have had the opportunity to be a mentor and to give another the gift of deep listening and heartfelt counsel, to serve as a sounding board to one painstakingly constructs their own answers to life's deepest question. I've been blessed by many mentors. Within my family, there was my troubled and often troubling alcoholic Uncle Walt, who, in spite of his failings, helped me learn how to be present and to look deeply into nature, and to appreciate the joy of nurturing vegetables in my garden. Important teachers of mine include that Professor David Bumbaugh and my recently deceased Buddhist teacher, Larry Ward. I'll share more about Larry and his teachings when I'm here in the pulpit later in the fall. In this community, several men from various iterations of the men's group have been important mentors, and numerous women I've known in this community. And most significantly, I suspect for others in this room, the Reverend Carolyn Colbert. What I have learned from both the influences of my mentors and my own experience is my greatest step. Like what was often the case for the Transcendentalists, comes from nature. Insights found there, within the woods, on lake shores, on the seashore. Insights found there rarely fail to fill my heart with joy. As Ralph Waldo Emerson described it in his famous essay, Nature, the happiest person who learns from nature, the lessons of worship. Learning from nature, the lesson of worship. Or as Mary Moody Emerson put it, we love nature, to individuate ourselves in her wildest moods, to partake of her extensions and glow with her colors and fly on her wings. So let us attend to wisdom passed down to us, and let us fly on nature's wings, as did Mary Moody Emerson. May it be so. Please remain standing as we extinguish our chalice and offer our closing words of benediction. So please join us in our extinguishing chalicing words. Well, let's see if we're going to get it. Well, many of us can know it. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the fire of commitment. For these we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Our closing words of benediction are from Mary Moody Emerson. I've got it here if you want it there.
We exist in eternity. Dissolve the body and the night is gone. The stars are extinguished. And we measure duration by the number of our thoughts, by the activity of reason, the discovery of truths, and acquirement of virtue, the approach to God.
And the gray-headed God throws their shadows all around, and their slaves catch now at this, now at that, one at the halo. They throw around poetry or pebbles, bugs or bubbles. Sometimes they climb, sometimes creep into the meanest holes, but they are all alike in vanishing, like the shadow of a cloud. Like the shadow of a cloud. Salam, shalom, amen, and blessed be you. I invite you this morning, before you move on to your busy, news-filled day, to just let the sounds of our postlude wash over you. Please be seated.